Being an island nation, Japan has a long history of relying on the ocean and maritime transportation. Japan's dependence on ocean transport was only exacerbated by its involvement in World War II. As Imperial Japan expanded its territory across the Pacific and the war against the Allies intensified, the need for shipping capacity grew rapidly. The Japanese government requisitioned hundreds of merchant ships to transport supplies, weapons, laborers, and eventually, prisoners of war. Throughout the war, the Japanese struggled to build and maintain a sufficient merchant fleet. As demand ramped up, so did the Allies' destruction of Japanese merchant ships. And as the war pressed on, and the Allies wore down the Japanese, desperation rose, and so did the conditions for the unlucky souls who were forced to endure the estimated 156 voyages of the so-called hell ships. Although there were many groups of people who were transported and suffered on hell ships during World War II, this video will focus primarily on Allied prisoners of war. The reason for this is by no means to erase the historical suffering of other groups, but rather to narrow the scope of the video in the interest of time and clarity. Like other nations involved in World War II, Japan took prisoners of war when the opportunity presented itself. Allied forces in the Pacific, though, may have had more to fear than their counterparts in other parts of the world. The Japanese were notorious for abusing and neglecting their prisoners of war. They also put POWs to work. In their effort to defeat the resource-rich Allied forces, the Japanese needed to maintain their stores of wartime necessities and supportive infrastructure. But most of the Allied POWs were captured during the fighting in the islands of the Pacific, and those who were relegated to forced labor had to be transported back to Japan or mainland Asia. For this task, and that of moving cargo and supplies, the Japanese government had requisitioned all kinds of merchant ships from private owners. Many of these ships would come to be known by the Allied forces as hell ships. As the prisoners were marched toward their transport ships, there may have been no cause for immediate concern. The ships may have been worn down from wartime service, but they would have looked like any other. The true nature of these ships, though, was yet to be seen. Once on board, the men were forced below into the holds of the ship. The holds were dungeons. Dark and dismal already, the holds would have quickly induced claustrophobic fear as the men were packed tighter and tighter into the holds. The air was quickly sucked out of the hold by the inhaling bodies. Unable to move because they were touching people on all sides, the men would have done anything they could to avoid suffocation, a possibility which many of them succumbed to, but all were terrorized by. The immediate fear probably distracted from the fact that there were no bathroom facilities to speak of, not even a mop or bucket. Once underway though, this reality became evident. No matter the length of their unknown voyage, the sanitation situation would have been uncomfortable, but the longer it pressed on, the closer it came to torturous or even dangerous. And the voyages of the hell ships were long. It could have been weeks at sea, as the ships often meandered, picked up and dropped off supplies and other prisoners, and coordinated with Japanese officials. All the while, the prisoners in the hold had no idea what was going on, where they were going, or how long they would be at sea. In such disorienting conditions, many would have simply lost track of how long they had been at sea for. It almost goes without saying that food and water were scarce at best. In the extreme heat of the packed holds, exacerbated by the natural heat of the Pacific Islands, many men perished without water. But the lack of food also took its toll, the crew sometimes not providing any food for days on end, only to break the fasting with the likes of a few pieces of moldy hardtack. The lack of sustenance was made worse by the fact that the men could only stand as there was not nearly enough space for sitting. In order to sleep, the men on many of the hell ships would have to take turns lying down, because there was nowhere near enough room for everyone to lie down at once. Sometimes the ships were not even prepared with the necessary supplies to sustain the prisoners, suggesting negligence on the part of the crew and the Japanese Central Authority. But at other times, supplies were outright withheld by the crew. One of the greatest causes of deaths among prisoners aboard hell ships was the crew's failure to distribute the supplies provided by the Red Cross. The general unwillingness of the Japanese to distribute Red Cross supplies is considered to be one of the primary reasons for the substantial difference in the death rates between POWs held by Germany and those held by Japan. As if neglect of the prisoners was not enough, the crew members of the hell ships would often beat and even execute their subjects, although this aspect of the abuse is overshadowed by the traumatizing conditions of the ships themselves. But survivors of the hell ships are practically unanimous in reflecting on their worst fear during the hell ship voyages: friendly fire. The hell ships were not marked as carrying POWs, so the Allies had no means of determining which Japanese ships were carrying their own men, aside from the interception and deciphering of Japanese coded messages. In the dark, dank holds of these ships, the men, who were packed too tightly to move and too weak to do so even if there was space, battled their internal fear of the ship being struck by a torpedo or an airstrike. After all, they were in a war zone, and the ships, being relatively small, could sink quickly if attacked, leaving only enough time for a few passengers to be trampled in the panic. Even if their own hell ship did not fall victim to attack, the long-lasting effects of the bone-shaking fear cannot be dismissed and likely had life-altering implications for those who survived. And the prisoners were right to be afraid. Of the 56 hell ships employed by Japan, 19 were sunk by the Allies, and the chances of surviving the sinking of a hell ship were not comparable to the chances of surviving a shipwreck of a different nature. The men were packed tightly below deck, and they were weak and disoriented, and the ships often sank quickly. To make matters worse, in the event of a sinking, the Japanese crew would usually actively sabotage what little hope of escape the prisoners had. When the Erison Maru was torpedoed, for example, the Japanese crew severed the rope ladders leading to the holds before abandoning the ship themselves. So, why did the Japanese crew treat the prisoners their ships carried in such an inhumane way? Well, there's the obvious answer, which is that they did not want strong and nourished enemy soldiers and sailors to escape only to return to the war front. And this is certainly part of the story, but it also comes down to the training and indoctrination of the Japanese men. According to Michael Sturma, writing for the Journal of Contemporary History, the Allies tended to represent the Japanese in propaganda as subhuman, but the Japanese tended to represent the Allies as inhuman, in other words, as demons or monsters. If this was a common view among the Japanese, it makes sense, once it was clear that the Allied prisoners would be of no use as forced laborers, that they would want to ensure the POWs would perish rather than risking their escape. To add to this, there was less of a fear of reciprocity by the Allies for abusive treatment of their prisoners of war. The Japanese were trained to never surrender, so the treatment of the disavowed soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured rather than dying was of little concern to the Japanese. Therefore, their own treatment of the Allied prisoners could not result in any retribution that would matter. Once the tides of the war turned and the Allies began taking back Japanese territory in the Pacific, the hell ship situation only became worse. Pressed for time and shipping capacity, and fearful that the captured POWs would be rescued by the invading Allied forces, the Japanese crammed them in even tighter into the hell ships. One of these ships was the Oryoku Maru. I'll be going over the story of this ship not because it is exceptional, but rather because it is representative of the overall picture of hell ships, and because the story is well documented. John M. Jacobs, an American prisoner of war, was herded into the hold of the Oryoku Maru. He was lucky in that he was placed in one of the less crowded holds, but he later describes the situation in the other holds of the ship. He writes, quote, "The prisoners had been so crowded in these other holds that they couldn't even get air to breathe. They went crazy, cut and bit each other through the arms and legs, and sucked their blood. In order to keep from being murdered, many had to climb the ladders and were promptly shot by guards. Between 20 and 30 prisoners had died of suffocation or were murdered during the night." When the ship departed from Manila and the Japanese-occupied Philippines on December 13, 1944, there were at least 1,600 Allied POWs in the holds. Most of these men had been in Japanese custody since 1942 and had survived some of the war's most notorious death marches. Also on board were 2,000 Japanese civilians who occupied the passenger spaces of the ship, which itself was a former passenger-carrying ocean liner. The next day, a bomber from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet sighted the Oryoku Maru and attacked, but had to return 2 hours later to finish the job. At this point, the ships escorting the Oryoku Maru abandoned her, and despite the efforts of the crew to defend the ship and the nearly 2,000 Japanese civilians on board, she was doomed. When they heard the terrified screams of the Japanese civilians above, the prisoners in the holds finally descended into panic and tried to escape, but the Japanese crew fired into the holds to keep the men back. The riotous hordes of prisoners trampled and suffocated each other in the 110-degree Fahrenheit holds until a 500-pound bomb nearly tore the ship apart. The Japanese could not hold the prisoners back any longer, and the POWs escaped from the holds and onto the burning deck. Those who made it into the water were captured before or immediately upon reaching the shore. Most of those captured men were then loaded onto another hell ship, which also sank. Of the 1,600 POWs originally loaded into the Oryoku Miru, only 600 made it to their destination of mainland Japan. The death rate of Allied prisoners of war aboard Japanese hell ships was undoubtedly high. Approximately 1 in 3 POWs transported aboard hell ships perished. By comparison, the death rate of POWs in Japanese custody during World War II was 27%, and the death rate of Allied POWs in German and Italian custody during World War II was 4%. The reasons for this are complicated, and in the case of the hell ships, the majority of deaths were the result of Allied attacks on the ships, justified or not. I encourage those interested to refer to the sources listed in the description of this video to gain a full understanding of the statistics and circumstances. In any case, the 62,000 Allied men who were transported by Japanese hell ships went through a horrific ordeal, and thousands of them died as a result. Those who did survive surely suffered later in life from the trauma they endured, and this video is dedicated to these survivors and all who lost their lives aboard the Japanese hell ships during World War II.